My mother-in-law shredded my $8,000 wedding dress for not letting my sister-in-law wear white, but she ends up in jail and her daughter doesn't even stick up for her. Weddings are supposed to be magical, but from the moment we announced ours, I knew it wouldn't be an easy road. My fiancé and I had been together for 4 years, and this was meant to be a celebration of the life we built together. Instead, it turned into a battleground, all thanks to my future mother-in-law. I spent years saving every penny and working overtime to buy the dress of my dreams. A gorgeous $8,000 gown I fell in love with as soon as I saw it. To me, it was more than just a dress. My mother never had the chance to walk down the aisle in a white dress. Her ceremony was simple, and she wanted this to be special. Of course, my mother-in-law didn't understand that. She made comments about how impractical it was and suggested I just wanted to show off. I brushed it off, thinking she was only trying to annoy me. But things really went downhill when my sister-in-law, my fiancé's younger sister, announced she was getting divorced. She had cheated on her husband and everything was a mess, yet somehow, my mother-in-law managed to twist the story to make her out to be the victim. In my mother-in-law's eyes, my sister-in-law wasn't just her golden child. She was the sun, the moon, and the stars. Suddenly, the focus shifted from our wedding to my sister-in-law's emotional recovery. A week after her divorce announcement, my mother-in-law came to me with what she called a suggestion, but it felt more like an order. She said it would be a wonderful gesture if I allowed my sister-in-law to wear white at the wedding. She claimed it would help her feel better and included, considering everything she was going through. I refused, explaining that white was reserved for the bride, as tradition dictates. Her face turned to stone as she told me I was being selfish. She argued that family should come first and that I should set tradition aside for my sister-in-law's sake. My fiancé tried to ease the tension by suggesting we find another way to make my sister-in-law feel special, but my mother-in-law wouldn't hear any of it. From that moment on, everything became even tenser. My sister-in-law wasn't much help either. She acted like a victim, making comments at family gatherings like, "I guess some people just don't understand how hard it is to go through a divorce." Needless to say, it was clear that those words were aimed at me. Things only got worse when my mother-in-law started turning other family members against me. At one point, she told my fiancé's aunt that I was completely excluding my sister-in-law from the wedding, which wasn't true at all. On another occasion, she hinted to her husband that I was being selfish and wanted everything to revolve around me. Soon, the whole family was gossiping, and in the version of events my mother-in-law was spinning, I was the villain. I tried to focus on planning the wedding, but her constant interference made everything nearly impossible. She had an opinion about everything: the flowers, the seating chart, the menu. Every decision I made, she found a way to criticize. She even tried to convince my fiancé that we didn't need such an elaborate ceremony and that we should just elope. He didn't agree, but her persistence was starting to wear him down. Then came a family dinner. My mother-in-law once again brought up the topic of my sister-in-law wearing white, this time in front of everyone. She said it was a shame that I couldn't be more understanding of what my sister-in-law was going through. She even suggested that I was acting out of jealousy. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I reminded her, again, as I had many times before, that it was my wedding, and my decision was final. She snapped back that if I really cared about family, I wouldn't be so inflexible. My sister-in-law started crying, saying she felt unloved and excluded. The room fell silent as everyone looked at me, waiting for my reaction. That's when my fiancé stepped in and told his mother that it was unfair to put me in that position. He said I had been more than reasonable and that she needed to respect our boundaries. My mother-in-law's response was nothing short of dramatic. She looked at us and said that if we weren't willing to compromise, we'd regret it. Then she got up and left, with my sister-in-law following her. After that, everything got even worse. My mother-in-law started pulling strings behind the scenes. Suddenly, several vendors canceled their services, citing misunderstandings. I knew she was behind it. She had taken control like she was the wedding planner, without my knowledge. The flowers were sent to the wrong address, and the cake order was mysteriously changed. It was clear she was trying to sabotage the wedding, but I had no concrete proof to confront her. Despite all this, my fiancé stood by me, but the stress was taking its toll. He felt caught between his loyalty to me and his family, especially with his mother constantly making him feel guilty. I tried to reassure him that I wasn't blaming him for his mother's behavior, but deep down, I started to wonder if our relationship could survive this without lasting damage. Both she and my sister-in-law are no longer invited to the wedding, that much is clear. But I still don't know if that regret she mentioned was meant for this or something else. Before continuing, don't forget to subscribe. New stories every day. Update 1. 2 days before the wedding, I expected a quiet night. With everything ready and set, I thought I could finally relax and enjoy what was to come, but that was not the case. It turned into a nightmare that will haunt me forever. I arrived at the wedding venue planning to do one last walkthrough and make sure everything was in place. The catering team was finishing up their setup, and the florist had left an hour ago. My wedding dress was safely stored in a designated room. I had spent years saving for that dress. It was everything I'd ever dreamed of. Delicate lace, a fitted corset, and a long, elegant train that seemed endless. The mere thought of wearing it filled me with excitement and pride. As I approached the room, I noticed the door was slightly open. I clearly remembered locking it earlier that day. My heart began to pound as I pushed the door open, only to find a scene straight out of a horror movie. There it was, my beautiful dress reduced to a pile of torn fabric on the floor. The corset was completely cracked, the lace shredded into pieces. Red stains, possibly wine, were splattered all over the white material, rendering it completely ruined. I called the venue's security to report the damage. The guard looked as shocked as I felt and mumbled something about checking the hallway's security camera footage. We spent an hour watching the recording rewind. At one point, the video showed the person who had threatened me, fulfilling that "you'll regret it" promise. There, on the black and white screen, was my future mother-in-law entering the venue with a large bag. She left less than 20 minutes later, visibly agitated and hot under the collar. When I returned to the room, my fiancé was already on his way after I called him in a panic. I showed him the video on my phone of his mother doing all this. He watched it a few times before telling me he'd handle it, so I shouldn't worry. He stepped out to make a call, and I could hear him shouting loudly from the hallway. When I stepped out, I could also hear my mother-in-law yelling on the other end of the call. She said, "She deserved it, that girl has no respect for this family. Maybe now she'll learn not to bite the hand that feeds her." I snatched the phone from my fiancé and told him that what she'd done was going to have consequences. He shot back that I had brought it on myself by refusing to let his daughter, his poor, heartbroken girl, get even a moment's escape from her life at my wedding. And before ending the call, he said, "No man will want to marry a woman who can't even respect her mother-in-law." My fiancé was beside himself, pacing back and forth as he tried to figure out what to do next. I could see how badly this was affecting him. He loved me, but he was also facing the harsh reality that his mother was ruining everything just to be right. He kept assuring me he'd be by my side no matter what, but he was clearly hurting. To make matters worse, I tried calling my sister-in-law since she wasn't picking up. When I confronted her and asked if she knew anything or was involved, she refused to look me in the eye. Her silence was enough to tell me she wasn't completely innocent. Even in the midst of all my devastation, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let this ruin my wedding. The thought of giving my mother-in-law the satisfaction of ruining my big day was unbearable. My fiancé, bless him, immediately sprang into action. He gathered our closest friends and family, explained the situation, and asked for their help. The news spread fast, and in less than an hour I had a small army of loved ones determined to save the day. Calls were made to every bridal shop within a reasonable radius. Friends scoured online for second-hand dresses and offered to pick them up. Some vendors who heard what happened even volunteered to adjust their schedules to help with last-minute changes. Even the mother of my maid of honor offered her own wedding dress, one she had carefully preserved for decades. As the hours passed, the atmosphere shifted from despair to hope that the wedding could still go on. The silver lining was seeing how many people cared about us and my wedding, all trying to help in any way they could. Finally, in the early hours of the morning, we found a solution. The owner of a boutique who'd heard my story offered to lend me an impressive dress from her collection. It wasn't the dress of my dreams, but it was beautiful and fit me perfectly. I know my mother-in-law tried her best, and it just wasn't enough. She delivered her best blow and couldn't bring me down. Maybe now it's time I return the favor. But I'm going to make her wait until after the wedding. That's what matters most to me now. Update 2. The morning after the wedding was supposed to be a time for me to enjoy my new marriage, but instead, it marked the start of my revenge on my mother-in-law. Though I wouldn't call it revenge, I'd say it was about putting her in her place. After the chaos of the night before, my husband and I decided that enough was enough. We needed to rein in my completely out-of-control mother-in-law. Early that morning, we headed to the police station, armed with security camera recordings and statements from the venue staff. It felt almost pathetic to be accusing my mother-in-law of something like this in front of an officer, as I recounted what she did just before my wedding. Luckily, the officer assured me the matter would be taken seriously. After all, it was an $8,000 dress. Within hours, my mother-in-law was taken in for questioning. They could have taken my statement and done nothing. Justice doesn't always act, but in this case, they followed proper procedures. We received many messages from family, some supportive and others not so much. You know, there are those who say we did the right thing, and then there are those who come to my mother-in-law's defense. What really stands out is that my sister-in-law didn't say a word defending her mother. I don't know, I would have expected her to at least try to minimize what happened. The police are now investigating her for a criminal act, since it all started with the idea of her wearing white at my wedding. Later that day, my mother-in-law was officially charged with property destruction. She was released shortly after, but that didn't stop her from trying to spin the story. That very night, she called for a family meeting, demanding that everyone listen to her. Since most of the relatives lived nearby, my husband and I agreed to attend, fully aware that it was our chance to set the record straight. The meeting took place at my mother-in-law's house. It felt like walking into the lion's den, but we had to share our side of things before she could change it. When we arrived, my mother-in-law was sitting at the head of the table, with the room packed with relatives. My sister-in-law was also there, but she stayed silent. Without wasting any time, my mother-in-law launched her attack. First, she accused me of being vindictive, claiming I couldn't let an opportunity to humiliate her pass by. She admitted to destroying the dress, but said it was just a moment of weakness, a decision made out of love for her family. She acted remorseful as she explained that she'd been blinded by her desire to help her daughter, who was going through a rough time after her divorce, and that a wedding was the worst reminder for her. She also argued that her request was minimal compared to the idea of postponing the wedding, a decision that, in her view, should have come from me without her even asking. According to her, the least I could have done was give my sister-in-law that moment. She owed it to her. My husband was the one who eventually spoke up. He signaled for me to let him handle this. I knew I'd have said something even harsher, but next to what my husband said, it would have just been praise for my mother-in-law. In front of all the relatives, and I mean everyone, he stated that my sister-in-law was only going through the end of her marriage because she'd been involved with another man, not her husband. He went on to say that she shouldn't be rewarded in any way for this. All she needed to do was simply attend the wedding and keep her mouth shut, while her mother kept reminding her that she was destroying what my husband and I were building with her careless choices. Instead, her mother defended her so vehemently that now he was even considering whether she should take a DNA test. My mother-in-law didn't know how to back out, because she had positioned herself strategically in the room to grab all the attention, and now that spotlight was starting to weigh on her. She even began fake crying, accusing my husband of turning his back on his own mother. She pointed her finger at me as if to say she didn't care about any of it, promising that I would spend the whole night poisoning her mother's memory. I told her, we spent the whole night doing our thing, but none of that. The room erupted into chaos. Voices were raised, and depending on whom you listened to, people were talking about different things. Then, amid all the shouting, my sister-in-law finally spoke up. She admitted that she had known about my mother-in-law's plan. She said she tried to change her mind, but didn't want to betray her by telling the truth. It wasn't a confession that made anyone happy, not at that moment. The meeting ended in disaster. Some relatives stormed out in anger, appalled by the depths of my mother-in-law's malice. Others stayed behind to console her, because, as her defenders said, a poor old lady like her couldn't possibly bear such suffering now. My husband and I left because there was no room in that space for so much self-righteousness together. We're still confident that the charges will hold and take this all the way. If my mother-in-law doesn't like it, she should have thought about the consequences before committing vandalism. She isn't a 7-year-old kid, it's a frail old woman, as her defenders say, at 58 years old. You might ground a kid by taking away their TV privileges, but for this fragile old lady, it's a criminal charge. That's just how it is. Update 3. A week after the wedding, while we were still adjusting to our new life, I got an unexpected call. It was my father-in-law. The sound of his voice, so polite and measured, made my blood boil. He said he wanted to fix things in the family, but what he really wanted was for us to let go of the whole thing with his wife. He started carefully, saying he hoped I was doing well. His tone was neutral but guarded, like he was tiptoeing around something fragile. I could barely contain my frustration and coldly replied that I was fine, before asking directly what he wanted. There was a long pause. I could hear him clear his throat, like he was trying to figure out the best way to say what was coming next. Then, he said he wanted to apologize for his wife's behavior. He admitted that things had gotten out of hand and said he wanted to make things right. I wasn't thrilled with his call. He was one of the people who had backed his wife from the start, even if he wasn't the loudest. And he didn't even show up at the wedding. I wasn't going to hold back just because he was the husband of a frail old woman, even if he was only 2 years older than her. He had been there the whole time, watching while his wife and daughter tormented me, doing absolutely nothing to stop them. Not even when his wife demanded that her precious daughter wear white to my wedding, or when she destroyed my dress, or when she humiliated me at every single opportunity. And now, after all of that, he was calling to apologize like that would magically fix everything? Great. I'll take that apology to the bank and exchange it for the $8,000, thanks. He said he understood why I was angry, but he wanted to offer a solution. He offered to pay $2,000 to make up for the dress, but only if I agreed to drop the charges against his wife. He even admitted it wasn't the full amount but said it was a gesture of goodwill. He asked me to think about it. Wow, what a deal. $2,000 for 8? Where do I sign? It was so ridiculous I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. I took a deep breath to calm myself, but it didn't help. I told him no. He could keep his $2,000 and use it to hire a lawyer. He was going to need it, along with whatever else we sued them for. There was tense silence on the other end. For a moment, I thought he might hang up or try to make a new offer. But no, he said it would be best to settle this privately, with no more drama, because all of it was already hurting the family's reputation. And besides, it wasn't like the dress was that important. If destroying an $8,000 dress isn't that important, then just pay it and move on, right? He spoke as if he was the one frustrated, but I was way past that. He said he was just trying to help, trying to make peace, and that I was making this harder than it needed to be. That's when I completely lost my cool. I told him he didn't get it. He and his wife had done nothing but tear me down, belittle me, and ruin what should have been one of the happiest times of my life. And now, after witnessing everything his wife had done to me for months, he really thought $2,000 was going to fix it all? I told him he should be ashamed of himself. There was another moment of silence. Then he asked me if I was really going through with the charges. If I was really going to let this break the family. I told him yes. That's exactly what should happen in situations like this. He mumbled something else, but at that point, I didn't care. I hung up before he could finish his sentence. I was shaking with rage, my heart pounding like crazy. Not quite cartoon style with it jumping out of my chest, but close. I couldn't believe he had called to say that. That night, while my husband and I were sitting together, I told him about the call. He had noticed something was still bothering me, so I laid it all out. He asked if his father had actually offered me money. When I nodded, he hugged me tight and said, "You did the right thing. You've stood up for yourself this whole time, and I'm proud of you." We're going forward with the charges, no matter what they say. And in that moment, I knew, we were stronger than ever. Update 4. The day of the family court hearing finally arrived, and in the days leading up to it, I could feel my blood pressure rising. I had no idea how everything would play out, but I knew I had to go through with it. As the date got closer, the tension between my in-laws and me only grew worse. My father-in-law and mother-in-law spent weeks calling and messaging me, trying to convince me to drop the charges, eventually offering $3,000 to settle the matter. But I stood my ground. I wasn't about to let them get away with this, not after everything they'd put me through, not after my mother-in-law destroyed my wedding dress out of sheer spite. I wasn't going to let this be another story where the villain gets away without consequences. When we walked into the courtroom, my in-laws were already seated. My father-in-law had his usual rigid, controlling expression, while my mother-in-law looked surprisingly calm, way too calm for someone about to face serious consequences. I got nervous. I wondered if there was something I hadn't prepared for. The judge presiding over the hearing looked around the same age as my mother-in-law, but she was no pushover, not after what she did next. The hearing began, and the judge's opening remarks hit my in-laws like a slap. She explained that the case was about property destruction and emotional harm, making it very clear that my mother-in-law had intentionally and maliciously destroyed the plaintiff's wedding dress, that is, mine. She emphasized that the damage wasn't just physical. This wasn't just about a ruined dress, but the emotional and psychological impact of the act. And she wasn't going to overlook it. My mother-in-law's face turned pale in seconds, but she somehow stayed quiet. My father-in-law, on the other hand, started to squirm. When it was my turn, I told everything. Stuff you already know, but I made sure to stress the emotional toll this had taken on me, which was true, but I wanted it to weigh in the verdict. When I finished, the judge turned to my father-in-law and gave him a chance to speak. He tried to defend his wife, saying it was all a misunderstanding. He said it was just a dress, that his wife had been stressed out by the wedding, and that she acted out of character. He tried to downplay it like it was a momentary emotional outburst, something that could be forgiven. But the judge wasn't having it. She cut him off and said minimizing his wife's actions was unacceptable. What she did, the judge explained, wasn't a stress reaction, it was deliberate malice. For the first time, my mother-in-law's composure cracked. She looked like she was about to speak up, but the judge wasn't finished. She turned back to my father-in-law and told him that his attempt to dismiss what happened was shameful. She reminded him that this wasn't a private family issue, to sweep under the rug, but a legal matter with real consequences. After reviewing the evidence, the judge ruled that my mother-in-law had intentionally destroyed the dress. She saw no remorse in her actions and no valid reason to justify them, so she ruled in my favor. My heart was racing as the judge continued. She ordered my in-laws to pay the full value of the dress, $8,000. And because of the emotional distress caused, she added $2,000 in damages, bringing the total to $10,000. My mother-in-law's face went even paler, she couldn't believe what was happening. My father-in-law looked like he was about to explode. But the judge still wasn't done. She turned to my father-in-law and brought up the attempted bribery. She explained that offering me money in exchange for dropping the charges, and worse, pestering me about it up until the day of the hearing, was unacceptable and potentially illegal. So she added an extra $2,000 fine for the attempted bribe. The total my in-laws had to pay was now $12,000. As we left the courtroom, I saw my sister-in-law sitting in a corner. She avoided everyone's gaze, hands clenched in her lap. Her silence said it all. She had clearly chosen to step back, wanting nothing to do with the consequences of her mother's actions. Now all that's left is for them to pay and be done with this. Edit. Answering a few questions. No, my mill didn't show up at the wedding. We had informed security ahead of time and she was banned from entering. Yes, in court she tried to bring up the fact that she paid for the wedding flowers, but the judge shut that down fast, said it was voluntary and irrelevant. The wedding itself went fine, though I know it could have been a lot happier without all the drama. And for those asking if my in-laws can avoid paying, no. If they don't comply with the payment order, they'll face harsher legal consequences, including possible jail time. Update 5. It's been an interesting few weeks with my in-laws. Everyone wants to know if they actually paid in the end, and I've also been asked whether my husband took a DNA test with his father. So I'll try to answer all of that here, just to wrap things up and leave no loose ends. No, my husband didn't take a DNA test. His father was present during that conversation, but he didn't say a word when my husband brought it up. The reason he didn't go through with it is because, in his own words, he sees his father as a doormat, and whether he's biologically his father or not, he simply doesn't care anymore. They're not on good terms, and we haven't spoken to them since the court case ended several weeks ago. My husband said it's his dad's karma not to know for sure if he's really his son, and if he ever wants to find out, he can take a test with my husband's sister instead. And yes, my in-laws have paid, though it ended up being messier than it needed to be. At first, the deadline set by the court was approaching and they still hadn't paid a dime. On the final day, we contacted the police to report that we hadn't received the payment, and they went to arrest my mother-in-law. At the very last moment, my father-in-law managed to come up with the money and got her out, though they had to pay an additional $500 fine for the delay. Clearly, they needed an extra push to follow through, but hey, they could have avoided that extra $500 if they'd just done what they were supposed to on time. There's an old saying that goes something like, intelligence is chasing them, but they're just faster. Sounds about right. The funniest part? My sister-in-law is still keeping her mouth shut. She's the one who started this whole mess, and yet she hasn't said a single thing. Honestly, I'm fine with that. I don't want to hear from her anyway. But it is kind of hilarious that she threw her own parents under the bus and then disappeared.